My name's Gareth and I'm moderating this session. I'm very glad to have been invited to chair this one because it looks an absolutely fascinating set of topics. And so we're going to follow the usual order. I'll introduce the speakers and each one will speak for 15 minutes and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A in which I think you, the audience, can send in questions, which I then read out to the panelists. As far as I understand, that's the way it works. So the speakers that we have today, we'll begin with Michele Cangiani. Michele teaches at the Università Foscari in Italy, and his talk will be on if pandemic is a symptom, what is the disease? Michele will be followed by Attila Antal from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, Hungary. And Attila will speak on the climate and ecological emergency in the era of the state of exceptions. Finally, then we'll turn to Nadjib Abdelkader, who is an independent researcher in France, and his topic is the global Green New Deal. The full topic is rather longer, but it'll be there in your program. Without any further ado, let's hand over to Michele.
Okay, now you hear me, yes, my paper begins by briefly considering the general situation in which the pandemic broke out. Then more specific circumstances and possible causes are mentioned. These premises also condition the manner in which a way out is sought. A couple of Polanyi's ideas are mentioned to conclude. To conclude that present difficulties and future problems have systematic causes that it is difficult to see how they will be solved. In this presentation, I can only indicate a few points concerning the starting point is the emergency of the pandemic, and the idea that this should lead us to consider its possible causes and consequences, and as they are more or less directly linked to the evolution of and situation of our society. So, in the first, to begin with, in the era of triumphant neoliberalism, the decrease in the cost of labor, cuts of taxes on higher incomes, and the reduction of social spending allowed the increase of the rate of profit. Those measures, on the other hand, reproduced depressive tendencies because they held back the investment and the mass of profit. The resulting difficulty of an adequately expanded accumulation tended to reproduce the crisis, the creeping crisis, periodical crisis, depression, and so on. A remedy was looked for in the massive recourse to the debt by families and states, and also in the accumulation by dispossession and the new imperialism, as David Harvey calls them, and further remedies are looked for in the creation of a new investment fields. For instance, public utilities, healthcare, platforms supplying various services, land grabbing, and most importantly, the so-called financialization. The crisis of the years 2012 was contrasted by a wide intervention of central banks. Monetary expansion policies continue with the current crisis due to the pandemic, an even more serious crisis. There is currently some income support for businesses and households, but the expansionary policy continues to favor finance. The Dow Jones Index is at its peak. It has increased by 50% compared to a year ago, and by more than 10% compared to the already growing trend of before the pandemic. On the one hand, it is true that the financial capital and productive capital are interconnected. On the other hand, there is a financial wealth, partly fictitious, which increases by investing where? Investing in itself. The growth rate of world debt is 2 to 3 times higher than that of world GDP. The concentration of capital, both productive and financial, increased, also pushed by the mass of capital in search of valorization. Both rent and inequality augmented. The free market ideology market ideology meets a paradox since, as James K. Galbraith points out in the book The Predator State, state services are asked to favor predation for the benefit of an elite dominated by international finance. In the meantime, the limits to growth forecasted in the 1972 report prepared for the Club of Rome have been reached and exceeded. James O'Connor's second contradiction of capitalism, the first being, according to Marx, the systematic tendency to over-accumulation. This second contradiction of capitalism has a growing impact as the increasing cost shifting by the productive system onto the human and natural environment makes such externalization of costs more difficult and expensive. The COVID-19 too is partially, at least, a social cost in the sense defined by K. William Kapp's theory. The social costs are the costs that the private or business enterprises shift on their human and natural environment. In the book Big Farms Make a Big Flu of 2016 by Robert Wallace, the author shows a connection between the onset and diffusion of pandemics and land grabbing, deforestation and destruction of biodiversity, agribusiness and industrial breeding, and wild urbanization. The paradox is that the pandemic can result in a shock economy dynamics supporting precisely the present style capital accumulation and even aggravating its above mentioned consequences. Sustainable development risks to be an oxymoron to the extent that it corresponds to the usual combination of growth and competition, market competition, and or monopolistic market competition, oligopolistic one, and to the interests of large companies and financial lobbies. The Italian government recently established, the new Italian government recently established under pressure from the mass media owned by those interests, financial and industrial interests, is preparing a plan which, instead of an ecological transformation of the model or the current model of development, according to this plan, most probably there will be only a green and digital modernization of the current model. Common goods will not be protected and removed from the market. Rights to health, education, social security, work, and basic income will not be guaranteed. Instead, the war industry will be further developed and military spending will increase. It should reach 2% of GNP as requested by the American ally or maybe master. The paradox of neoliberal policies is that they tend to be strengthened by their being unsuccessful. The case of the Italian healthcare system can be meaningful in this regard. It used to be, thanks to the reform of 1978, instituting a national health service, a public, universalistic, and relatively efficient system. 3
minutes to go, Michele, just to give you that alert. Thanks.
Yes, okay. I try to go. Okay, no problem. Okay. I go on. The idea is that the system has been privatized, progressively privatized, and in Lombardy, the region which has been more terribly hit by the pandemic. The 40% of total expenditure goes to private organizations, which are generally not prepared to face emergencies like the present pandemic, because they this kind of strategy would require unproductive investment. Generally speaking, the choices regarding which activities will be carried out follow criteria and market economy rather than social convenience. Then there is another part, another section concerning the connection between geopolitical and financial strategies, the role of the know-how, the copyright strategy, the rich nations refusing the proposal made by less favorite countries of suspending the copyright on antivirus. And this was refused, and naturally, what is astonishing, but this is everybody knows this kind of things. The final news to comment is that 1 month ago, a big manifestation at Havana asked for stopping the embargo lasting from 60 years. Maybe Cuba is a terrible danger, peril. I don't know. Maybe they can destroy the United States, and this is the reason why this embargo continues. And Italy is one of the most important producers of weapons, and we are free to supply weapons to Egypt or Turkey. We have just made 2 ship wars for Egypt, but we are not allowed to deal with Iran to give this country the possibility of some way defending people from the virus and to try to reduce the mortality of a population. The two.
Could you wind up now, please, Michele?
Yes. It is even less. I was to remember 2 ideas of Polanyi's. One is this conference of 1940, the trend toward an integrated society, where he denounces the dilemma our society is caught in, the dilemma between stopping an economic system risking to lead society to ruin and is very dangerous for the life of people and so on. And on the other hand, the need that in some way the economic system could go on, because without economy, as any child knows, it is impossible to survive. And this dilemma is in fact a blackmail that we have to in some way accept without any for the moment any opportunity to get out of it. So excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele. And now we hand over to Attila.
So, thanks for having me. Perhaps you are seeing my screen. So, just a minute. So, it's a great pleasure and honor being here. It's an ongoing project on climate and ecological emergency in the era of state of exception. After a brief introduction, I would like to put an emphasis on the exceptional moment, exceptional measure of our time. After that, I'm trying to analyze the contemporary overlapping forms of state of exception. And my third and last point is about some conclusion, the state of exception or state of emergency in the era of climate and ecological crisis. We live in the era of overlapping state of exceptions, the climate and ecological emergency, the permanent crisis of global capitalism, migration crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. In this paper, it has been investigated, relying on the Hungarian political regime and Hungarian examples, how and why the exceptional measures have started to restructure our life. Upon the case of the Hungarian authoritarian populist regime, the municipal experiences in Hungary as well, and other contemporary tendencies, the three main forms of state of exception will be investigated here. First of all, the exceptionality of migration crisis of 2015, the climate emergencies declared by the local governments, which is more political declarations and not legally accepted version of exceptional measures. And the third one is the overlapping forms of COVID-19 related emergencies. I will argue here that the main outcome of the exceptional measures is the new rise of the executive power and authoritarian regimes. He will rely on the state of exceptions. Despite of the authoritarian tendencies and abusive application of the exceptional legal order, the COVID-19 crisis proved that it is worth considering institutionalizing the climate and ecological emergency as a tool in struggle of planetary crisis of our time. So my first point is about the exceptional measures of our time, or this some kind of Polanyi moment in terms of state of exception. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, the rise of emergency power defines our time more than ever. The disappearing borders of war can be interpreted in a way that the war is dissolving in the peace situation, and the rise of state of exception remarkably indicates this procedure. The authoritarian populist regimes focusing on the security issues, for instance, terrorism, domestic problems, climate immigration, understood and applies this state of exception-based form of new government. These regimes are using the power of the police or penal state to create political enemies and annihilate them as a modern form of homo sacer after Giorgio Agamben. The state of exception and the modern forms of deprived social groups as contemporary homo sacer have become the main accompanying parts of authoritarian populist regimes of our time. I'm arguing in this paper that the authoritarian crisis management was based on the never-ending exceptional situation even before the pandemic crisis. It is to say that the conditions of authoritarian rule pre-existed the crisis and were certain to define how the government would respond to this overwhelming crisis. My second point is about the mentioned forms or overlapping forms of state of exceptions. It has been argued here that the Orban regime used the state of exception on migration and COVID-19 crisis in an authoritarian way to maintain and reinforce its political power. This doesn't mean that we should give up the extraordinary measures and the instruments to tackle and address the global climate and ecological crisis. I propose here that there is a need for the democratic control over the extraordinary measures that will be introduced in the context of the global climate and ecological crisis. First of all, the mentioned refugee crisis and, as I named it, the tailored state of exception. The two-third majority of the Fidesz in 2010 is rooted in the party's penal populist attitude and commitment toward law and order. In the center of the authoritarian populist regime is the penal nationalism based on blaming and criminalizing otherness or others in a very similar way in neoliberal penal systems. For the penal nationalist, crime control is not just about protecting its people, but also defining the nation against external or internal groups of people as well. The exceptional politics started with the refugee crisis in 2015, and a biopolitical hate campaign unfolded based on the biological demonstration of the enemy, hate campaign on the streets, defense of the south border of Hungary, and moving beyond the migrant crisis, campaigning against Brussels, NGOs, George Soros, and several kinds of inner enemies. Hungarian opposition mainly. In Hungary, the refugee crisis didn't cause a serious social and political challenge. However, the regime was able to create a long-lasting exceptional situation without any real danger. The Orbán regime, upon the case of migration, introduced and prolonged the state of exception in legal terms. The state of emergency upon the case of migration is a tailored one, as I said, because it hasn't been declared without any real social danger. The second point is the climate emergency based on the grassroots, based on the green and climate emergency NGOs. This new form of state of exception is induced by anthropogenic climate change and ecological disaster. It is to say that based on the experience so far, the declared climate emergencies are more political declarations and not legally accepted version of exceptional measures. Several European municipalities and cities declared political climate emergency. And what are the main policy and political outcomes of these new instruments? The climate emergency is based on the claims of new forms of climate movements which are committed to mitigating the effects of the climate crisis and fighting to get decision makers to finally adopt more effective actions. At the same time, it is clear to see that the climate emergency has a very strong potential in terms of democratizing the contemporary emergency measures. The summer of 2019 has been the hottest in Central Europe, even in Budapest and in Hungary, in Central Hungary. And several climate movements have been organized in Hungary by the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion's Hungarian local organizations. The ER and the Fridays for Future movements were able to make a strong impact because it involved the youngest in struggle for global survival, demonstratively calling for attention to the ecological and climate crisis instead of school on Friday. Both organizations have a strong appearance in Hungary and regularly organize actions. The most important events were the climate strike protests in 2019. Added to this, the opposition forces won Budapest and made advance in rural towns at the municipal election in October 2019. Moreover, in 5th of November in 2019, Budapest General Assembly declared a climate emergency for the first time in the Hungarian history. And the third point goes to the mentioned overlapping COVID-19 crisis and state of exception. The global pandemic crisis has truly rewritten Orbán's original political plans for the next general election of 2022. The Orbán regime didn't expect such a crisis to evolve and spread as it has. Orbán was able to change his political strategy and started to take the pandemic seriously. At first, given the fact Orbán didn't know exactly how devastating the crisis would be, the regime tried to continue the exceptional measures evolved for the refugee situation. On 6th of March in 2020, Orbán spoke of migration and the coronavirus as equal challenges. Moreover, 4 days after, he argued, it's a quote, there is a clear link between illegal migration and the coronavirus epidemic, quote end. After that, there was a tipping point because Orbán and his communication strategists perceived the fear of the Hungarian people and the fraction behind of the government as well. And this proved to be crucial because the people recognized there was no link between immigration and the epidemic. Nevertheless, Orbán has found the political potential of the epidemic and started to manage it in a military and a policing way. The Prime Minister has seen higher political risk in economic and less in epidemiological consequences. It's a terrible story. That's why the introduced measures are about to protect the economy first. It's very remarkable, very similar to Margaret Thatcher's assumption, neoliberal assumptions, and not the workers. Orban argued, it's a quote, "We should fight against this crisis by not giving up our goals, the work-for economy and the possibility of a proud life," quote ends. In line with the wave of the waves that have unfolded since the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis in the last year, the Hungarian government has declared 3 states of exceptions due to the coronavirus situation. One in March in the last year, one in November, and one in 1 February in this year. Each extraordinary period was associated with the so-called empowerment laws, which are special authorization of the incumbent Hungarian government by the parliament. It is an authorization to implement long-term governing by decrees. The fundamental law otherwise provides provide the government with the possibility of governing by decree, but this is severely limited in time. Decrees are only valid beyond 15 days if the parliament authorizes the government to extend the decrees before the expiration of these 15 days. The empowerment laws eliminate these constitutional limitation. So this is the unconstitutional forms of state of exception. Moreover, during the first wave of the pandemic, the government proclaimed the special form, or the third form of state of exception, called health crisis emergency, and it was in force until December in 2020. Some consequences based on this analysis. The COVID-19 crisis will show whether the extraordinary tools used by the governments in connection with the pandemic can be taken forward in tackling the global ecological and climate crisis. The need for a climate and ecological emergency stems from the fact that we are long past the time when we could have dealt with the climate and ecological crisis within the existing economic, social, and political system, or the global capitalism. That is why extraordinary measures are needed. All this requires the action of nation-state governments and all political regimes in the world, in parallel with the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion phenomenon. The so-called issue of climate emergency is getting attention. Joel Wainwright and Geoff Mann are trying to outline in their book Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future, how an exceptional state can offer a way out of global crisis. The author's starting point is that the ecological crisis hasn't cared for the state of emergency for a long time, even though the security paradigm of exceptional governance is increasingly affecting the entire planet. Wainwright and Mann so-called climate leviathan utopian framework of analysis refers to the possible scenarios for the various options for the political sovereignty and the global weight of the ecological disaster. This scenario assumes that in the response to global ecological challenges, an entity will emerge over nation-state sovereignty, that it's not necessarily a single person, but a power figure capable of deploying extraordinary means to protect life on the Earth. Its sovereignty extends to the entire planet. This is planetary sovereignty. It acts through the Earth and acts to protect earthly life. The essence of Wainwright and Mann's concept, then, is the climate leviathan as a potential and supreme sovereignty can introduce the state of emergency to the entire planet and decide on fundamental environmental ecological issues. In addition to the climate leviathan scenario, Wainwright and Mann outline other ideas according to whether they question the existing socio-economic structure, the global capitalism, and whether the proposed solution cover the planet as a whole or as a unit of sovereignty, or they remain at nation-state level. The scenario within the capitalist system thus remains a climate leviathan that assumes planetary sovereignty, in contrast to which the reactionary climate behemoth remains at nation-state level. Wainwright and Mann argue that is a quote, behemoth is Leviathan's greatest immediate threat, and why unlikely to become hegemonic may well remain disruptive enough to prevent Leviathan from achieving a new hegemonic order. If Leviathan essentially reflects the dream of a sustainable capitalist status quo and Behemoth a conservative reaction to it. Quote ends. The climate emergency movements represent this climate Leviathan concept because their main aim is the international action in terms of climate and ecological emergency. In my view, due to the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic crisis, and the emerged social economic crisis, move away the global order from the climate Leviathan to this direction of climate behemoth. This is reflected in the mentioned Orban regime's overlapping state of exception. The authoritarian populist regime recognized the political opportunities of the exceptional government in the framework of overlapping crisis. It is to say that the regime during and after the COVID-19 crisis is using the state of exception in an authoritarian way, and this framework will maintain its political power. The main challenge here, how to democratize the concepts of climate and ecological emergency and move forward this agenda against this authoritarian state of exception tendencies, which are the main obstacle of the planetary emergency measures. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Attila, and for sticking to time. I didn't interrupt you because I thought you were going to wind up around the right time. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let's move on finally to Nadjib. And after Nadjib's talk is done, you can please start sending in questions, which I will then collate and read out to the panelists. So Nadjib.
The question we're facing is whether we can envisage a global cooperation for Green New Deal in response to the global climate change, or a return to national policy for an economic rebirth in a world characterized by a struggle of nations. This question is the defining issue of the coming world, and I propose to take a step back to understand the deep issue behind those two options from a social and political point of view, and the ideology they underpin. Then we are going to dig a furrow and glimpse the reasons that have brought the modern world to where it currently sits. In his famous book, The Great Reset, the chairman of World Economic Forum, Mr. Klaus Schwab, developed his view on both political and environmental issues for the post-pandemic world. Schwab starts from the premise that national governments, having been active actors in the health crisis and seen by their inhabitants as providential saviors, will have a big role to play in the post-pandemic world. Nevertheless, in his view, it is not a question of nationalist fault, but of reconstruction of economic growth through policies supporting ecological conversion for the reconstruction of a more egalitarian global order. However, egalitarian is defined from a strictly economic and utilitarian point of view. Schwab does not deny the tensions between state and the struggle of states within the globalized system. But this is not contradictory with the maintenance of the globalization process, provided that global governance keeps being built. Thus, Chairman Schwab acknowledged the tensions between the return to the nation state and the global project in favor of a recovery policy and a global cooperation for a Green New Deal. But for him, that tension is not inextricable. His ideas are as idealistic as they are superficial. Idealistic because he thinks ideas create the material reality, and in his enchanted world, the problem of the real world, counter-movement, ecological equilibrium, and consequence, financial crisis, etc., do not exist. The world is imagined through an engineering way of thinking as a mechanism. Then to him, we are moving in the direction of a world shaped by a dialectic between national policy for economic recovery made by government and administrations and global cooperation, which will transform, ritualize, and pacify the struggle of nations into bureaucratic form. To understand the deep issue of this question, I suggest you to start from an historical perspective. One of the main actors of our modern world is the state. But we have to know that this form of social and political organization has only existed in a very short time frame in human history. The state is defined as a social, political, economic, and complex organization, which is also ecologically fragile. Until the 16th century, when this form became widespread in the world, states have almost never been formed following an endogenous process. On the contrary, the decisive condition that led to their formations was almost invariably foreign invasions. In the last medieval period, the main facts were the decline of the feudal system and of chivalry, and the concomitant rise of centralized kingdom and guilds of merchants. The centralized power starts to be structured. In France, as a mark of sovereignty, King Philip VI in 1347 imposed a royal monopoly on money printing. This decision represents a decisive turning point, which conferred power upon the royals, thus giving a decisive advantage over the regional lords. The army, the law, and the bureaucracy all came under the centralized control of the royal. The control over the currency can be seen as the backbone of the system, the essential tool in the hands of the monarch to control the territory, a control which was until then merely theoretical. The other highlight of this period is the rise of the merchant's paradigm. Together, this mutation goes with the transformation of perception, which is illustrated by the rise of the universities, which became a competitor to the church and monasteries. In these secular institutions, the students acquired a cultural background, but also technical skills in the art of keeping accounts, paperwork, and giving the authorities the means to emancipate themselves from the authority of the church as a service-providing institution. With this rises a new paradigm. This is how in the 12th and 13th century, the figure of the merchant, until then suffering from a negative outlook, was valued. Unlike aristocratic values advocating ostentatious spending as a sign of virtues, the merchant ideology praised the virtues of saving, rationality in action, and time management. And it was during the Renaissance that trade starts to be seen as a means of strengthening the prince and the power of the kingdom, and a lever to impose his supremacy. Then in 1615-1616, Antoine de Montchrétien published his Traité de l'économie politique, in which he praised the sovereign's effort in transforming the kingdom into an organized productive system. At the same time, we can observe an evolution of techniques. The new accounting techniques brought a transformation in the way men perceive their place in the cosmos: time, space, materials, fauna, flora, human, etc. Everything becomes translated into measure, classification, columns of figure, etc. In other words, the material world was become more and more abstract and intangible in a self-sustaining movement. And then money became the tool that permitted us to measure everything. The new civilization demanded a permanent increase in trade and production. This abstraction from the merchant's paradigm would in turn spawn another moral revolution, that of scientific abstraction. Of course, techniques also change with society and mentality, but it would be wrong to see this phenomenon as linear. Naturally, technical evolutions will be shaped by the mutation of the worldview and dominant ideas. Then the goal was to achieve a better social being, but this goal was viewed as an increase of exploitation, profit, and enrichment of the upper strata of society. The evolution of techniques was put into a particular historical trajectory. It was shaped by the quest for profit and power. So the formation of what we call a state in the modern meaning, is the result of a convergence of power coercion, trade accumulation, and technology exploitation. This brings us to the question of the contradiction we all know between improvement and habitation. The poor man shall be satisfied in his hand habitation, and the gentleman not hindered in his desire improvement. So we know improvement means technical progress, as we have just described, improvement of productive structure and material, and habitation, people, livelihood, and environment, the material basis of their cultures. To Polanyi, this question is interpreted as the expression of a fundamental problem of modern and contemporary history and actuality, that is the radical opposition between the attachment of the poor to their habitat, which they want to protect from degradation, and the desire of the richest to increase their income. It is thus on the basis of a new paradigm that the nascent state favored improvement to the detriment of habitation. Since the post-medieval era, we have observed a struggle among industrial nations for power, to which correspond a struggle of the poor for their livelihood. Later, in the 18th century, two movements appeared or rose that announced our modern world. The physiocrats, who advocated the authority of competent people to analyze and understand the law of nature, and the philosophy of nature, which advocates the authority of what we call now scientists or engineers. The first government while the second shaped the outlook. After the Napoleonic Wars, Henri de Saint-Simon advocated industrialism and what we call now technocracy. This transformation view from below is as aggressions provoked popular movement and revolt called counter movement. Of course, these popular revolts triggered retaliations from the dominant power of the 19th century, early modern civilization, which led to us to its breakdown with the advent of fascism and Nazism. But from the ruins of the World War II would emerge the 20th century civilization. Polanyi saw very early the danger of this new civilization, the iron law of technique. The defining movement or starting point of this civilization may be Harry Truman's inauguration speech on January 20th, 1949. For the first time in history, he used this strange concept of development to describe an economic, social, cultural state, while at the same time he coined its contrary with the term underdevelopment. And since this time, development has become synonym of progress. This concept became the backbone of this civilization and justified the rule of technocracy in capitalist countries, communist countries, and the third world alike. And facing the ecological problem, in the 1987, a commission composed by technocrats, presided over by Gro Harlem Brundtland, published the report Our Common Future that popularized the concept of sustainable development and an international cooperation for it. Ecology became technocratic, and its language, its worldview, or its program. And it was very quickly—
Three more minutes, Nadjib.
Okay, and it was very quickly adopted by technocrats and governments. Facing the myth of progress as necessarily beneficial technical progress, Polanyi pointed to the technical phenomenon as a total social phenomenon. And he described how this is indeed a grave danger for freedom and democracy. We have made to recognize in this case a closer link than is apparent on the surface between the present enormous advances toward the technological civilization and the threat to freedom that all over the world is latent in the deep. This became the great fact at each level, national, international, or global, in Europe, America, India, or East Asia. Then the current question of global cooperation or struggle of nations for economic recovery as presented by Klaus Schwab become a mere dialectical question between two levels of technocracy, global or local, national or international. The cooperation for an international Green New Deal or national economic recovery maybe neglects the struggle with these nations between the technocratic outlook and democratic and social outlook. To conclude, I would like to open new subjects for future debates. What could be the consequence of this evolution on environment, nature, societies, culture, democracy, and sovereignty? Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our speakers. We now have plenty of time for Q&A, so please do type in your questions and hopefully they'll come up on my screen and I'll read them out for the speakers. No one has asked questions so far, so I'll just ask one question of only one panelist. Sorry, I didn't prepare this as homework, really, it just came to me. And that's to Attila. You were telling us about this book, Climate Leviathan, and you listed just two of their four scenarios, right? Climate Leviathan and Climate Behemoth. You missed out Climate Mao, and you missed out, in some ways, the most important one, albeit the vaguest one, which is Climate X. I don't know if that came up, it's just Climate X. And I think, I mean, I was not concentrating as carefully as I should have done because this is the first time I've chaired on Zoom and I'm trying to make sure it all goes to plan. But I think I heard you align the Fridays for Future movement with Climate Leviathan. Now, I think one could dispute that. No, it's a pluralist movement, many of whom would feel closer to the Wainwright portrayal of Climate X, a tiny minority perhaps to Climate Mao, and certainly none of them to Climate Behemoth. But, you know, so Climate Leviathan is the kind of cosmopolitan, liberal, rationalist, bourgeois global governance approach. But a lot of the Fridays for Future movement would really be very critical of that, I would suspect. No, I found your talk fascinating. In fact, all three speakers very interesting, and I look forward to hearing the questions that hopefully will come in soon. Since no questions have arrived, I suppose I can throw that straight to Attila. I was thinking of gathering questions, but I haven't seen any so far. So let's, oh, here's one. Let's gather some questions then. So there's one for Attila and one for Michele. I've been asked to read it out. Dear Professor Cangiani, it's always a pleasure to listen to you. This is a question from Bruno De Conti. You mentioned, Michele, that neoliberalism tries to solve its problems by strengthening neoliberalism. And in my country, Brazil, this is precisely the case. All non-conventional measures that are being taken are legitimating liberal reforms and promises that the austerity policy will be even stronger from 2022 onwards. Do you think this might be a trend for the whole world? So that's two questions we have so far. Let's hand them over to Attila and then Michele. And while they're speaking, please type in any further questions. Attila.
Thank you for this very, very important question and remarks. Of course, it's totally right that I missed the two other concepts according to Wainwright and Mann. As I mentioned to you, it's an ongoing project. I am trying to elaborate all these forms of climate issues. But according to this topic, this state of emergency situation, I tried to find the more coherent concept from Wainwright and Mann, and this is my hypothesis that in terms of the necessary introduce of a state of emergency, state of exception, there is two ways. One way is the mentioned, as I named it after Wainwright and Mann, the Leviathan concept, which means in my terms that the mentioned concept, this cosmopolitan, transnational, and planetary sovereignty-based way of state of exception, which is very, very important to overcome the nationalist questions and nation state interest. Take a look at the current COVID-19 situation. The vaccine nationalism and vaccine imperialist structure show that this planetary discussion and planetary sovereignty is very, very important question, because there is a lack of planetary sovereignty. On the other hand, the climate behemoth is very, very coherent with the authoritarian populist regimes, and that's why I choose this option. But taking back to your question, because it's very, very important, and there is a controversy inside, because you mentioned very well that Fridays for Future and the Extinction Rebellion are highly critical with the liberal elite and the cosmopolitan elite and the transnational elites. It's very, very important. But I put an emphasis on that there is a controversy inside of this movement, because, as I mentioned, they would like to force the decision makers to make an act and make legal frameworks against the global crisis. So, of course, this is a grassroots movement, but they would like to put an emphasis on the decision-making process and force them to make legal frameworks and legal issues and political agreements on the climate issues. So it's a huge controversy, but as I said, the core idea that the transnationality and overcome the national boundaries is very, very important, is inside this concept, even though, of course, there are several controversies. So the promise of the planetary sovereignty and planetary action is inside in this way, I would say. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Michele has arrived. It's so brief, I'll just read it out to you, Michele. You can probably see it on your screen. Can you explain the geopolitics behind vaccine patents? So if you could take on those two, Michele, and meanwhile, there's still time for questions to come in, especially those for Nadjib would be particularly welcome if anyone has any. Michele.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Very briefly, yes, I think that this neoliberal trend is a global trend. We don't see for the moment the possibility of overcoming this kind of capital accumulation. The difficulties that this system failed to solve are a constraint making change more difficult. Furthermore, the impasse of which Polanyi said, the difficulty of that a whole society has to face its own problem, the problem that it has created trigger authoritarian solutions. And so most fortunate and rich countries can still maintain a certain measure of democracy, though declining. There is a systematic construction of public opinion by people who have this opportunity to do so, also in so-called democratic countries. And naturally, there are varieties of neoliberalism in different countries, and the inequalities between people within every country, and inequalities and iniquities in the relationship between nations. About the other question, geopolitics, what is the connection with the COVID? There is a connection. There is the problem of confronting imperialisms, China, United States, trying to some way profit of this situation. But there can also be a risk. The example that I mentioned before of the difficulty of less favored countries to get at least a minimal quantity of vaccines can maybe move something and develop some kind of criticism to the present system and the domination of the empires and the what I forgot. I mentioned before. I forgot to say is the other Polanyi's idea of his concession of coexistence. The idea that any country, any region, any community could look for its own way to solve its own problem and to develop. And this is precisely what did never happen before, because there was the Cold War confrontation, then for the universal, the American neoliberal universalism, and this is a problem because also peoples deprived of the possibility of the opportunity to face with their own forces, with their own ideas, their own problems. This creates a condition favorable to fascism or in any case authoritarian solutions, because people feel a kind of vacuum. They must solve their problem in some way. Now,
thank you, Michele.
Yes, this is all. Thank you to you.
The next question is for Nadjib. The question comes from Peter Kirby, who has a recent book out a couple of months ago on Polanyi, Karl Polanyi and the Contemporary Political Crisis, Transforming Market Society in the Era of Climate Change. So that's quite relevant to this panel, I thought I would mention. And Peter Kirby's question to Nadjib is this. Nadjib identifies technocracy with the concept of development. If I understand him correctly, he draws on Polanyi to identify this as a threat to freedom and justice. What does he, Nadjib, see as the way of moving beyond this threat?
It's a very hard question because the technocracy is very powerful. It has the meanings of industry, of the states, and we are just all citizens. And maybe this can be our power is to become citizen, to not as an individual isolated by other, but together first in the neighborhood and then in the city and more and more. I mean, people make politics. People invest political actions as not as a militant in a party, left, right, center. No, as a citizen with people debate and make society together. And then it permits to build a democratic outlook and to make a fierce and to resist to technocracy, because the technocracy is grow up because there is nothing. The society is made by isolated individuals, so it's easy for it to rule the society. But when people build counter movement, it's more difficult. So people to make society again, I want to say, and I don't have nobody have a magical way to move beyond this, because every situation are different in every place. So all we can say is to be citizen in the place we are together.
Thank you, Nadjib. Finally, we have one question for all the speakers. I should apologize. I'm not quite sure who I'm apologizing on behalf of, but this is a case where the panel really is, I'm afraid, a manel. All four speakers on the all four on the panel and all four questioners are all men, so that's a real shame. But anyway, let's move on. The final question is from Jérôme. Here we are, Jérôme Nicolai. And the question is for all the speakers, and it is this: is a federalism of cities a solution to the state of exception? Are nation states part of the problem? So could we kick off with Attila?
Yes, I tried to answer this question by typing some ideas, but just very briefly, of course, nation state and the nationalism, of course, it's a problem, but I would say not just a problem, or it's a part of the problem. And I mentioned to the question, as I said, that of course federalism could be some solution in terms of the cities, but don't forget there are several ecological and social inequalities relating to the big cities or mega cities. So there are several problem occurs in terms of climate and ecological injustice in terms of cities which are very similar to the nation states. Of course, there are several tendencies in Hungary because the highly debated situation between the Hungarian government, Orbán regime, and the opposition municipalities, and there are several claims to get, for instance, the EU money direct from Brussels to the cities. And of course, it could be a solution. But as I said, that in terms of the state of exception situation or the ecological and climate emergency, on the one hand, emerging network of cities or mega cities is very, very important, but I would say cannot be a real solution in terms of globalized crisis as well. Thank you for that.
Nadjib.
Can you repeat the question, please?
If I can find it. Yeah, here we are. Is a federalism of cities a solution to the state of exception? Are nation states part of the problem?
Oh, this question is also very difficult because there is no magical solutions for this. It depends the situation because every nation states are different, different institutions, different outlook, and same for the cities. So what we call nation states, what we call city. And then after we can answer, and for each situations, I cannot give a global answer. Sorry, but yeah, for any country have different situations. So the solution is anywhere is to become citizen again. That's what I can say, because at any level we have the same problem about the confiscation of democracy. So I don't think the question can be asked in this term, because because of this, any level we have the same problems. So maybe we have to find a dialectic way between local and national and also global, because the problem are at any levels.
Thank you, Nadjib. Michele, you have the last word.
Very, very briefly, the word pandemic itself means that it is a global problem, and so it would be logical to face it through an international policy and beyond any kind of nationalism and nationalist states. Naturally, states have a role that cannot be denied and excluded. The same is true for the ecological problem, that it is in general a general problem, a global problem to be faced by federations of nations, international agreements. An attempt, it would be maybe for the first time a vital need to try to arrive to an international, a global politics. But this is very, very difficult because the tendency of the virus and of big pharma as well, and to imperial countries too, is to divide and to avoid a global response to a global problem. That's all.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists and to the questionnaires, the contributions from the audience, which were very interesting and stimulating and fell nicely on each one of the panelists. And thank you to the organizers of the conference. Take care, everyone. And I believe the final session is beginning quite soon. That'll be in the timetables. So with that, I will wish you well and goodbye.